iPod, 1,000 songs in your pocket.
Undoubtedly, the iPod is one of the best inventions ever conceived by man. It opened a new path for a whole line of products. If the iPod failed, there might be a chance that Apple would have never even released the iPhone. The iPhone was actually conceived a long time ago. It was not like 2004 or 2005 when it was conceived. It was conceived around the time the iPod was also conceived. Who knows what Steve Jobs would have done if the iPod failed. But recently, the iPod has sort of been non-existent. So here's where the story all started. A London man named Kane Kramer files a patent in 1979 for a music playing device, and it looked like this. Now this doesn't look like an iPod, but it for sure looks like an MP3 player, and it is definitely ahead of its time. Now the person who owned this patent didn't have enough money to keep it, so he lost the idea. This gave everyone the advantage to make their own MP3 player. In the 1990s though, digital MP3 players were not the most popular thing. At first, portable players were mostly disc and cassette based, and also Sony was the monopoly king for music players with the Walkman, dominating all sorts of other portable music players. But Steve Jobs was not impressed, as he wanted something that could fit a lot of songs. Later on, flash memory players at that time could only fit a few songs. They looked ugly, they were heavy, and it would take a long time to import songs onto the player. So in theory, moving hundreds of thousands of songs onto the device would take hours. Also, the industry for these portable music players was a lot smaller before the iPod era. This is when Apple saw the potential. They got in contact with a man named Tony Fadell. This is someone who has worked on music players in the past. His latest project was a Windows CE music player. No joke, a music player that runs on Windows. He was tight on a schedule of only 6 weeks and had a very small team. Thankfully though, he was able to make 3 prototypes. He presented the first 2 that were the worst designs compared to the first one. It was clearly done to lower Jobs and Apple's expectations, and of course the third one was the best. The scroll wheel was added to make it a lot easier to scroll through music. Other players would use buttons which would get annoying to click time and time again just to get to the song that you want. Also, to ensure that it was the smallest and most compact music player they can make, Steve Jobs would drop the iPod prototype until there were no more bubbles. When it hit the bottom of the water and oxygen began to rise, Jobs said, "Those are air bubbles. That means there's space in there. Make it smaller." Apple would unveil the iPod on October 23rd, and it would cost $400. The next year in 2002, the iPod 2G would be released. The difference between the two is that the 2G was $300. It was also Windows compatible. A touch-sensitive wheel was added instead of a mechanical wheel. Then the very next year in 2003, Apple would release the iPod 3G. This one had a different design, making the pause and play buttons, the skip buttons, and the menu button all at the top. Now, I'm not a fan of this. I'm glad that they came to their senses and later on put the menu, the skip buttons, and the pause and play button back on the wheel. Apple also began using lithium-ion batteries instead of lithium polymer batteries. This would reduce the iPod's battery life. Like I said earlier, Apple came to their senses and put the skip buttons, the menu button, and the pause and play button back on the click wheel. Apple also would begin to put less stuff inside of the packaging. Now today, we would usually just see a charger and a pair of headphones come with our phone, but back then, Apple actually had some pretty cool stuff to add on as well. It had a dock, a carrying case, and a wired remote. These were for the more higher-end iPods, depending on the gigabyte range. The 40GB iPod 4G would only come with a dock in terms of extra features. The iPod's battery life would go from 8 hours to 12 hours of battery life. This will also be a time when Apple would introduce iPod Photo. This, of course, would be a way to view photos on your iPod. Apple would then introduce a new iPod called the Ipod Mini. This is different from the iPod Nano. It had its own line. It only had 2 generations ever, and then it was killed because next, Apple would release 2 new variations of the iPod. The cheapest iPod and Apple product ever made, the iPod Shuffle, would release on January 11th of 2005. Apple would later release the iPod Nano on September 7th, 2005. It was also Apple's way of destroying the rest of the MP3 market market because there were MP3 players that were cheaper than the classic iPod. So with this method, it would be able to destroy every other competitor in its way. So with the Nano and the Shuffle, this would be able to compete with the smaller MP3 players. Later on in 2005, in October, the iPod 5G would be announced. It would now have a different color, black. It would have a new design as well, and would have the ability to play MP4. It can also play shows, podcasts, music videos, movies, purchased from the iTunes Store, or even from Google Video, because back then Apple was a little bit more easygoing. This is also the time when the iPod would be able to play games. Of course, there weren't that many games, but it still is a pretty cool feature to add. In 2007 though, everything would change. Apple would announce the iPhone. Steve Jobs called it the best iPod ever.
An iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator. An iPod, a phone. Are you getting it?
With the ability to take photos and use some of the default apps and the internet. Not just some sort of silly phone internet, but like the real internet. This was a huge change. They also wanted to release a better iPod. It's an iPod that was made for people who wanted a better interface, with a couple of handy apps available. And thus the iPod Touch was born. But the very next year would be the year that Apple would truly become the monopoly of mobiles for a very long time with the introduction of the App Store. At this time, there were only 500 apps available. Today there's over 2.2 million, but for that time, it was really shocking. As more apps were being introduced, the iPod and iPhone became the go-to place for mobile gaming and for other handy things. The App Store began to rival Nintendo's DS and Sony's PSP, mostly because games were cheaper or even free on the App Store compared to Nintendo and Sony's prices. It was such a big impact that Nintendo even pointed the finger at Apple for slow and bad sales. During Q1 of 2009, Nintendo saw a 66% decline in sales of the DS. But unfortunately, the fateful day came on October 5th of 2011 when Steve Jobs would pass away. This was a tough year for Apple, and it's sort of reminiscent to what happened with Walt Disney when he died. There's no chef that knows his recipe better than the chef himself, and giving that Steve Jobs vibe would be impossible without Steve Jobs. Thankfully though, he left some projects behind, and the fifth iPod Touch would come out the next year in 2012. It had an incredible new design, an amazing camera, and also a new iPod Nano and iPod Shuffle would also be released. The Nano sort of looks like a smaller iPhone, and it's so thin that it can't be any thinner. You couldn't fit a headphone jack, and that's probably what Apple would do if iPods were still here. But then 2013 came around, and there was nothing being mentioned about any iPods. And 2014 came around, and there actually was something mentioned about an iPod, and it would be on the same fateful day that the iPhone 6 and the Apple Watch would be announced. Apple killed off the iPod Classic. Some claim the reason was because they ran out of materials to make it. And I'll go over the other reason in just a second. In 2015, the iPod would vanish off of the Apple website. Now, if you want to find it, you'll have to click on Apple Music, and then it's there. Now, this is 2018's Apple website showing that the iPod is on the Music tab. In the past, when you clicked on the Music tab, you wouldn't actually see the iPod. You'd actually have to scroll down a couple of slots just to see it. That shows that Apple was ready to kill the iPod. They were barely promoting it. It seemed almost like they were trying to hide the iPod. This would also be the year that Apple would update their iPods for the very last time, with the release of a new iPod Nano, iPod Shuffle, and iPod Touch 6. There was barely anything updated with them, they were just more powerful, they had new colors, and that was about it. In July of 2017, Apple would remove the iPod Nano and iPod Shuffle, making the iPod Touch 6 the last available iPod by Apple. And I honestly wouldn't be surprised if they even remove the iPod Touch in the coming years. Right now the iPod is on the deathbed and there's no way to resurrect it. So why is Apple doing this? Well, it's a simple answer. It's an answer that we all really know. And that answer is innovation. We already have the ability to play music on our phones, so it wouldn't make any sense to carry around an iPod in addition. Now, has Apple done this before where they've killed stuff? Yeah, a lot. Not just the headphone jack, but they've also killed the floppy disk player. Apple very much is reminiscent of Disney. Whenever they see the need to kill something because they feel it's getting old, they do it. Now, do they make the right decision all the time? No, not at all. There are some times where you just look and you have to ask, what were they thinking? Now, Tim Cook also made a statement saying that the iPod sales were on the decline, and I'm not surprised. I think Apple Music also might be a reason why iPods don't really exist. Why buy a bunch of music that you may not even listen to in the future, because you've listened to it so much when you can just pay a subscription every month? This is a very unique video. I've never actually had a video where the culprit was time. In a nutshell though, the iPod isn't really dead. To me, it's sort of like a ghost of the past. The iPhone was created to be the best iPod ever before the iPod Touch. It made listening to music on your phone more popular. Listening to music on your phone in the past was possible, but it was not at all what it is today, believe me. The iPhone just made everything better. There were smartphones before it, but the iPhone opened up a whole new way to see a phone. It's not just about making calls, it's about the actual design, it's about the features. It's a form of art. It may not be as advanced as, say, a Galaxy phone or a Google Pixel phone or any of the other competitors, but when you're buying an Apple product or an iPhone, it's sort of the same reason that you would buy a brand of shoes like Yeezys. You're buying it because of the name more than the product. And that's sort of what Apple's taking an advantage of. Yeah, I miss the old Apple when it was a mix of both of those ideas. Now it's just the brand that's being sold. So now the iPod rests where it will always be for eternity, a music player.